Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. This is our second part of the seminar on the logico-epistemological tradition of Buddhism. Today we have the great pleasure to have one of the major, if not the major expert in the logico-epistemological school of Buddhism, Professor Birgit Kellner. She really doesn't need any introduction for people who know a little bit of Buddhist philosophy or Indian philosophy in general, but I'll tell you a few things about her. And the reality is that she has so many accomplishments that I need to read here and there. So she studied Tibetan and Buddhist studies at the University of Vienna, and then she got her PhD in Indian philosophy at the University of Hiroshima. After that, she has conducted several postdoc projects at the University of Vienna, and finally, in 2010, she became a professor for Buddhist studies at the University of Heidelberg. After that, she's been, since 2015, the directorian of the Institute for Culture, Asian culture, of Asian culture and history at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And there she has been the PI of a few projects, one particularly which is very dear to my heart, called Rationality, Meditation, and Liberation in Indian Buddhism. And she is a full member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and an adjunct professor at the University of Heidelberg, and very importantly, the president of the International Association of Buddhist Studies. So with no further delay, I give you Birgit Kellner, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thanks to...
Yes, sorry. Okay.
Thank you to both Serena Saccone and the Istituto Filosofico and Wolfgang Kaltenbacher for the kind invitation. I have a presentation here that, given the screen size, may be a little small if you sit in the back. So if you have vision impairments, please move to the front so you can read it. There is also a QR code which should allow you to download the presentation. This may be especially interesting if you are really interested in the subject matter. There is a small bibliography PDF appended in the end that you may want to consider. My talk will deal with the logico-epistemological tradition of Buddhism only to 50%, because I want to convey the sense in which Indian philosophy is comprised of multiple traditions that engage each other, critically engage each other. And therefore I will talk first about a different Indian philosopher, Kumarila, from the Mimamsa tradition, and then I will address Dharmakirti. To give a little bit of historical background, just insofar as it is relevant for the discussion, the Indian philosophy in the period under consideration, I will be talking about two philosophers from the 6th to 7th century, was an ecosystem of multiple religio-philosophical traditions. Relevant to my talk are the Mimamsa, the Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, and the Buddhists. There were, of course, also others, but I will not address them here. In this particular period, there is a certain philosophical discourse or concern that has greatly risen in prominence in the course of the first half of the first millennium, Common Era. It makes its appearance in the first few centuries, and that is epistemology as a theory of knowledge instruments or pramanas. We've encountered this topic already yesterday in the talks of Serena, Saccone, as well as Patrick McAllister. And Patrick in particular gave a very nice, also philosophical perspective on what pramanas actually are. He translated the term as knowledge sources, sources of knowledge. Other translations that are currently used are means of valid cognition. The term pramana itself has this instrumental aspect that is also, this linguistic aspect, the instrument, that is also exploited in philosophical traditions, made great use of. And so it's sort of a means, an avenue to gain trustworthy awareness, knowledge of something that should subsequently enable goal-directed activity, according to many of these philosophers. Now, different traditions define and endorse and work with different knowledge instruments. Sense perception and inference are the ones that are most widely accepted, but there are also others that I have here listed simply with their most common translations. Analogy, implication, scriptural authority is also a particularly important and contested one. An aspect to consider for Indian philosophy in this period is what I would call an intertwined development. On the one hand, of substantive philosophical discussions, for instance, about the nature and existence of a self, the theory of karmic retribution, the theory of what exists and what doesn't exist, the analysis of awareness, of consciousness, all of that. But at the same time also a development of theories about, in the realms of epistemology and logic, these knowledge instruments. And you kind of have a back and forth between discussions on what's necessary for a self to exist and the question, how can we know that? How can we prove that? And what kind of theories and methods do we need in order to prove our claims or refute those of others? Philosophical awareness, and you will see a philosophical analysis, as you will also see illustrated in my talk, is shaped by an awareness of others that do not necessarily agree, or might not even have the same standards in coming to terms with what one agrees and what one doesn't agree with. So even if philosophers do not explicitly engage in the refutation of others, of the views of others, I think their works are always shaped by an awareness that these others exist. And this multi-traditionality, this horizon, I think is particularly important to understand Indian philosophy. So let me start with a philosophical perspective on the subject matter. What I will be discussing here is in philosophy, in Western philosophy, referred to as negative facts. The question, most fundamentally, whether the domain of facts, of what objectively is out there, bifurcates into a negative and a positive domain that exist independently of each other. If it does, if there are things called negative facts, if our linguistic practices or logical practices of negation do really have some objective correlate out there, some kind of non-existence or negativity, the question is, how are these negative facts known? If not, if there are no negative facts, if there are just realities out there and negativity and positivity are simply aspects of logic, of linguistics, the question is how negative truth claims are accounted for and whether they need some kind of special theory over and above what usually accounts for positive or affirmative truth claims. Now, when we turn this philosophical outlook to the specific environment of Indian philosophy, we are dealing here with the problem of whether abhava or asattva, absence or non-existence, are real, objectively real, existing or given independently of the mind and of language, and how they could be known. Yeah? So this is how the problem is framed in Indian philosophy. If you want an overview of this problem of negative facts in Indian philosophy, a very accessible one, philosophically accessible one, and brief one, there is an article by Brendan Gillen from 1997, but don't trust what he writes about Dharmakirti. Yeah? Okay, so let me turn to the first group of Indian philosophers that would claim that there are negative facts and that they are known. This is typically advocated by so-called realist traditions of Indian philosophy, by the Nyaya. And the Nyaya advocates, since Udyotakara, he's the first one to come out and say this explicitly, that an abhava, an absence or a non-existence, is known by sense perception. Yeah? So perception is the knowledge instrument that is responsible not only for existent things, but also for absences. The Vaisheshika tradition, that is closely affiliated with the Nyaya tradition, comes to the view that negative facts are known by inference. This is attested since Prashastapada in the 6th century, and also interestingly in a text whose title is reconstructed as Dashabhadata Shastra, since this is a text that actually exists only in Chinese translation, which is really, really interesting, because Brahmanical philosophical texts are usually not available in Chinese translations. The third theory, that is the one I'm going to focus on here, is that negative facts are known by a special knowledge instrument that is defined only for this particular purpose, and it's called absence, abhava. So both the object and the knowledge instrument are referred to with the same term, abhava, absence. This theory was advocated by Kumarila from the Mimamsa tradition in the 7th century, probably 7th century, but it's also rejected and disputed by Prabhakara, probably a contemporary from the same tradition. But I will not discuss Prabhakara's views in particular. They are also really difficult to understand and to disentangle from the later tradition because they're preserved only very elliptically. Now let me turn to the second group, or rather the second person in the second tradition in this group. And this group claims that there are no negative facts. That actually the distinction between negative and positive belongs only to the realm of what we would call propositions, or actually in the analysis offered by these philosophers, conceptualizations. Yeah? We have already heard yesterday that Indian epistemologists take as their basic unit of analysis instances or episodes of awareness, of jnana, sometimes also translated as cognition. So that's the main unit of trade that they're focusing on. Also, when they're dealing with logic, we have this close relationship between logic and epistemology here. So propositions is really not a term that is genuine to this particular environment. Now, the Buddhist epistemologist and logician Dharmakirti, whose life date was probably sometime between the mid-6th and mid-7th century, that is currently a matter of debate, he argued that negative conceptual content is warranted by inference, and he defined a special type of evidence for this particular purpose. Dharmakirti is a younger contemporary of Kumarila. This is now, I think, widely and commonly recognized as being established. The relationship between these two philosophers was for a long time disputed because it's not really clear who refers to whom. But we can see now quite clearly, and we can also, I think, now see it clearly, that Dharmakirti responds to theories of Kumarila. Not directly. That would be nice. Not by mentioning his name, for instance, but the theories that he refutes and that he engages with, this horizon of the others, certainly include Kumarila. Now, on the matter of whether negative conceptual content is warranted by inference or needs to be warranted by inference in all cases, there is some controversy among Dharmakirti's followers. And this is linked to a line of thinking that Patrick McAllister already nicely introduced yesterday, namely that in certain instances, when a cognizing person has past experience or habituation, is used to has a certain epistemic history, has determined certain things a lot in the past. They have abhyasa, that's the operative Sanskrit term. Then they may instantly know something simply after perceiving something. And some, actually most of Dharmakirti's followers think this is also true for negative determinations. As the standard example goes, when I perceive an empty surface, like a piece of ground, and a pot is absent there, and I determine the absence of a pot does not exist here, this is conceptual, purely conceptual, there is no non-existence separately here, out there. I may need an inference to do so, but I may also do it simply by perceiving this empty piece of ground and no pot absence that flashes up in my mind. I won't be talking about this controversy, I just want you to know that it exists. There is actually one person, only one person in the 8th century, Dhammottara, who thinks one always needs inference in these cases, in negative cases. Now, let me turn to Kumarila. A framework condition for his philosophical enterprise that should be borne in mind, even though it will not really affect what I will be talking about here, is that the ultimate authority of Vedic injunctions of Chodana imposes limits on epistemological theory. So we can talk about knowledge instruments and we need to analyze them, but there are limits to that, only insofar as it doesn't endanger the ultimate authority of Vedic injunctions. There are a few works that have dealt with Kumarila's theory of absence as a knowledge instrument, and you have listed them in the bibliography at the end. Anyway, now let me start with an ontological precondition, and this was called by John Tabor Kumarila's idea of the unitary nature of substance. Now, to understand this, we need to bear in mind that the Vaisheshika tradition had come to posit a certain ontology by that time, and a hierarchical ontology that distinguishes different categories, so-called padarthas, namely substance, quality, and motion as the three oldest and primary ones, and secondly also universals, particularities, and inherence. So the Nyaya, that also adopts this particular categoriology, and the Vaisheshika basically subscribe to the principle that a real entity is real because it is comprised of ultimately real categories. So these categories are kind of ultimate building blocks. Kumarila has a different approach to this categoriology. For him, a real entity is real because the categories are somehow absorbed into it. So they are not ultimately different from each other. The operative Sanskrit term is adyanta bheda abhava. This is important as a background to understand his approach to non-existence or absence as an objective reality, as a negative fact, because like the individual categories, substance, quality, and motion, non-existence is also somehow absorbed into this reality. It is a part of that real entity. But it is not treated as a separate category. There are later Vaisheshika authors that posit absence as a separate category, as a seventh category, in addition to the 6 ones that you have listed here. And some modern authors also ascribe this to Kumarila, but that is not warranted. So it's real, but not a separate category. Non-existence, therefore, has a certain objective reality. And basically, it sort of comes down to the principle that an object is existent as itself, and it is non-existent as anything else. But both these existence and non-existence form objective parts of it. This is most succinctly expressed in verse 12 of the chapter on Abhava, the Abhava Paricheda of Kumarila's Shlokavartika, his central philosophical work, which you have here in my translation, with reference to a real object, a vastu, which is constantly existent as itself and non-existent as anything else. Certain knowledge instruments cognize a certain part at certain times. Objectively, that non-existence is always out there, but it doesn't always become cognized. Now, which part is known, whether the existence or non-existence, depends on the cognizing subject's intention. Sometimes you may be interested in knowing positive aspects of a particular thing. Sometimes you may be interested in knowing, in wanting to know what it is not, and determine that it is not something else. But Kumarila assumes that the respectively uncognized part always acts as a kind of supportive factor. So there is something that is in the foreground, but the whole nature of the thing always plays into it. This non-existent, or to assume that this non-existence is an objective part of reality, is necessary for Kumarila in order to explain difference, in order to explain that there are actually different things out there, and that individual things are different from other things. He refers to this as the unmixed character of reality. Vastu asamkara siddhi, the establishment of that, for that absence is absolutely necessary. Kumarila has a certain taxonomy of 4 types of absence as an objective reality and as an object of absence as a knowledge instrument. The first 2 are related to causality, prior absence, Sanskrit prag abhava, and posterior absence, Sanskrit pradvansa abhava. So you can see here the examples are actually from a domain where you could say that one thing transforms into another. Milk transforms into sour milk. This is not entirely coincidental, because the idea that an effect is absent in the cause, and a cause is absent in milk, is in Indian philosophy positioned against another theory of the Sankhya, the so-called Satkaryavada, that assumes that effects do pre-exist in their causes, and that there is some substantive reflex of the causes also in the effects. So these first 2 types are consequently related to causality. Mutual absence is the type where actually this connection of absence with difference, with the difference between real things, is most obvious. Namely, a cow is not a horse, a horse and a horse is not a cow. So there is a mutual absence here that is reciprocal. Absolute absence is interesting because you might think of it as referring to absolutely non-existent things, the horn of a rabbit, a hare's horn. Interestingly, Kumarila's analysis does not zero in on this unreality or absolute non-existence, but he conceives of this absolute absence as also something relational. The surface of a hare's head that is free of any outgrowth or hardness is the absence of a hare's horn. This analysis is quite disputed. There is a lot of discourse about such non-existence entities and how to analyze the corresponding linguistic expressions. And the argument is all these absences, these 4 types of absences, were not real, milk would exist in sour milk, cows and horses, etc. So reality would collapse. Reality as it is given would collapse. As far as these classifications of absences are concerned, there are very different approaches throughout the history of those traditions that do actually endorse the reality of abhava, of negative facts. There's not much attested before Kumarila, strictly speaking. The earliest text to explicitly refer to a 4-fold classification, but I think without listing the individual types, is Bhartaharisvakya Padilla, at least the earliest one I know. Commentators also read this into a particular section of the Vaisheshika Sutras, but the individual labels of these categories are not actually mentioned there. Okay. Now let's turn to knowledge instruments. Kumarila endorses and defines altogether 6 knowledge instruments, which is quite a lot. This realm bifurcates into 2 domains. 5 knowledge instruments grasp existence. That's perception, inference, verbal knowledge, analogy, and implication. And the 6th one grasps non-existence. That's absence. But in the way it is defined, you will see that the abhava as a knowledge instrument, absence as a knowledge instrument, is defined in dependence on the other 5 knowledge instruments. You can see this already here in the first verse of the Abhava Paricheda. Absence is a knowledge instrument with respect to an aspect of a real entity for which the 5 knowledge instruments do not arise for the purpose of comprehending its existence. Okay? So this contrastive definition becomes quite clear. Where the 5 other knowledge instruments do not arise, absence applies. And he reads this into the Shabara Bhashya, which is an earlier commentary on the Mimamsa Sutras, which he has in mind as an authoritative text. Absence as a knowledge instrument, to continue, is defined in the 11th verse of the Abhava Paricheda. It is the non-arising of perception and so forth, perception and the other 4 knowledge instruments, that is called knowledge instrument absence. So he here picks up an expression that occurs in the Shabara Bhashya, pramana abhava. The syntactic analysis, compound analysis, is actually quite a difficult topic. There are also different options here, which is why I have translated it a little bit in a cumbersome fashion. But he says when Shabara speaks of pramana abhava, he speaks of this knowledge instrument absence, and that basically is the non-arising of perception and so forth. This non-arising is further defined as the non-modification of the soul or the awareness of the other reality. Now that's a bit mysterious and obscure. Why is there an or in between, and what do these 2 elements actually mean? The disjunction, again, is understood, interestingly, in very different ways by Kumarila's commentators and by Buddhist critics, Shantarakshita and Kamalashila. And I will here only refer the one by the Mimamsa commentators. And it has to do with this idea that a pramana is an instrument, and this instrument has a particular result, a state of knowledge, perhaps, or a certain form of practical activity and behavior. And the disjunction in the second half here is taken by the commentaries to relate on different focus, different perspectives that one might have on one and the same cognitive process. So, when it comes to apprehending absence as a result, when one latches onto the actual awareness of absence as the outcome, then the knowledge instrument is the fact that the soul does not modify into a cognizer in existence. The underlying idea is that, provoked by the existence of an external object, the soul, the Atman, transforms into a cognizer, a jnatra, of that particular object's existence. When that modification does not occur, hence the absence is known. The second option refers to the actual awareness of the other reality, and the other reality is here taken to equal abhava. Yeah? The knowledge instrument is the awareness of non-existence, of this other reality, when one focuses on the resulting practical behavior as a result. So this is, in other words, a theoretically relevant disjunction, a disjunction that is relevant in relationship to different elements of epistemological theory. It is not intended or not understood by Kumarila's commentators as alternative, providing alternative definitions, yeah? Just different perspectives on one and the same epistemic process. Okay, this was a little technical. Kumarila also refutes that other knowledge instruments might be responsible for apprehending absence. First, he engages with the Nyaya view that perception apprehends absence, so he must have already known this particular theory, which is plausible since we know that Udyotakara preceded him and actually articulated it. And he argues that perception cannot actually, well, the five external senses cannot actually come into contact with an absence. They can only come into contact with an existence, with something that is existing for the Nyaya. And since perception is defined by a sense-object contact, it cannot be responsible for apprehending an absence. Secondly, he also refutes inference, where here it's a little bit unclear whose theories he refers to. I mentioned earlier that certain Vaisheshika authors advocated inference, but the information on that point is rather sketchy. And Kumarila argues that inference cannot apprehend absence because this non-arising of the five knowledge instruments, if it were postulated as inferential evidence, cannot fulfill certain necessary conditions that such evidence has to meet. First of all, it is an absence and it cannot have an inferential relation. Yeah? Inference is by this time, and in Indian logic in general, understood to involve two properties, two states of affairs, one that is proven and one that is mentioned as drawn upon as evidence, such as smoke as evidence for fire, and it requires that there is a certain inferential relation. In the case of smoke and fire, this would be causality. And by this time, and Kumarila is actually one of the authors that try to develop more formal criteria for this inferential relation. So it's a strong, invariable relation that connects them, connects these two states of affairs, but independent of what the content actually is, whether it's causality or some kind of other relationship. So there is a certain formality to his theory of inference, but an absence cannot have an inferential relation, he argues. There is a special type of problem that arises, and we will encounter it in a similar form later in Dharmakirti. A non-arising, is an absence of arising. And so, if one assumes, and Kumarila assumes, that an inferential reason can only be a reason if it is itself known. Smoke can only infer fire if one knows smoke, and knows smoke as evidence for fire. Then the question is, if you invoke an absence as inferential evidence, how do you know that absence? Well, for absence, you have defined the evidence of non-arising. So you would have to draw on a further non-arising for establishing this particular absence. And then you can ask the question about that second non-arising. Okay, this too is an absence, and how do you establish that? And you never arrive at an end. And therefore you have this infinite chain, you have an infinite regress of justification. Okay. And this is the reason why inference cannot apprehend an absence. It depends, I think, essentially, the first argument not necessarily, but the second argument essentially depends philosophically on this idea that there is a separate domain, a separate epistemological domain that works with negative states of affairs, because that creates this kind of circularity. Okay. Kumarula's purpose. I've already mentioned that for Kumarila, absence as reality has the purpose of explaining or accounting for difference among real entities, and that's why he thinks it is necessary and has to be real. If one turns to the purpose of absence as a pramana, as a knowledge instrument, and looks, how does Kumarila actually use it in his works, both in the Shloka-Vartika and in the Tantra-Vartika, one finds out that he uses it, I think exclusively, to reject entities that other traditions assume to exist. Yeah? For instance, or actually in particular Buddhist notions, the idealist notion of emptiness, shunyata, which he here understands in the Yogacara fashion, the idea that the Vedas were composed by a human author, which is an absolute no-go for Kumarila, who assumes the eternality of the Veda, or the idea that there is a human being that can be omniscient, namely the Buddha. Yeah? And there is a certain pattern of argumentation that he develops here. He argues that all these principles cannot be known by perception, by inference, by verbal knowledge, etc. So he goes through the 5 pramanas for existence one by one, and by an argument of elimination comes to the conclusion, hence, they must be known by absence as the 6th knowledge instrument. And this conclusively demonstrates that they do not exist. So in this application, you see a connection between non-existence and falsehood, false truth claims. The pattern of the argumentation in itself can be understood as what in Western logic and philosophy is classified as an argumentum ad ignorantium, the argument from ignorance, where absence of evidence for something existence counts as evidence for its non-existence. In logic textbooks, this is treated as a fallacy. You may know that. And if you think of how Senator McCarthy in the United States thought to conclusively prove that people were communists, you will immediately understand why this argument is highly problematic. Somebody is not known not to be a communist, and therefore they must be a communist. Yeah? So this is a clear fallacy, clear logical fallacy. However, I would like to point out that there are conditions under which arguments from ignorance are legitimate, and they are legitimately used in scientific discourse and also in some areas of philosophy. The quality of an argument from ignorance depends a lot on what one could call the searching mechanism. Yeah? If you look for something, if you look for evidence for something, and you have a clear idea what that evidence might be, and you have a trusted mechanism for how to find it, a well-defined, methodologically proven scientific experimental apparatus, for instance. And even though you have done all this work, you don't find it, then you can be pretty sure it doesn't exist. Huh? It's never a deductive argument that comes out of this. It doesn't acquire this level of certainty, but it's a pretty strong, what logicians call abductive argument. And so Kumarila's arguments actually depend very much on how you analyze the quality of his searching process. whether you find the arguments convincing, for instance, that a human author of the Veda cannot be perceived or not be inferred, etc., etc. Yeah? And now, since there can be a lot of disagreement about this, the engagement with his patterns of argumentation on the part of subsequent Buddhist authors like Shantarakshita and Kumarila is very extensive. This pattern of the argument from ignorance itself is actually in Indian philosophy quite widely attested. Buddhist authors actually also use it in actual philosophical disputation. Shantarakshita and Kamalashila use it as well. And Udyotaka, for instance, already refers to Buddhist views. I don't exactly know where they come from. Buddhist arguments that an Atman does not exist because it is not known through any of the three pramanas: perception, inference, and scriptural authority. Okay. So far about Kumarila's purpose. Now, I've spent quite a lot of time with Kumarila, and I will now move on to Dharmakirti. Dharmakirti, as I introduced initially, is among the authors who do not accept the reality of negative facts. For him, knowing non-existence simply means to conceptually determine that something is absent. As we have seen in the standard example, the pot that is not here on this piece of ground, it simply means basically in relationship to this piece of ground to determine that another object is non-existent. The pot is non-existent. And for Dharmakirti, such a determination is possible only in highly restricted cases. Okay. First of all, the ontological preliminaries or presuppositions. For Dharmakirti, there are no negative facts. Reality and existence are coextensive. Yeah, the only things that are real are things that are existence. And existence, in turn, is defined by the causal capacity of physical as well as mental events to produce effects. This capacity is limited to momentary entities that have no temporal duration. That's not really relevant for our context here, but it's an important part of Dharmakirti's philosophical approach, this ontology of purely momentary events. An absence, as is frequently stated in his works, but was already stated by an earlier Buddhist philosopher, by Vasubandhu, has no causal capacity. Absences are generally, one could say, causally deficient. Yeah? They can neither be produced, nor can they be producers. They cannot be causes, and they cannot be effects, since they are totally unreal. Yeah? Negative and positive are features of conceptual content and not of mind-independent reality. So what it means to know non-existent, again, or more specifically, is that some knowledge instrument results in conceptual, verbal, and physical behavior or treatment regarding an object as absent. So this notion of vyavahara, we've had it yesterday in the sense of conventional reality. This is a little bit of a different concept. It encompasses these three elements of conceptual cognition or ascertainment, verbal designation, and physical activity. And conceptual determination is the primary one, since the others two essentially depend on it. Okay. Like Kumarila, Dharmakirti also argues that perception cannot grasp absences, but he does so on the basis of a different theory of perception. For Dharmakirti, perception is non-conceptual completely. It is a direct form of awareness, and it is non-erroneous. And he advocates what could be called a causation cum resemblance theory of perception. Mind you, we're here talking about a Buddhist philosopher, so we do not have an Atman or a self as somehow involved in the cognitive epistemic enterprise behind the scene. We only have momentary events. Perception basically is analyzed as a causal mechanism where an existing object causes, together with additional causes, such as the sense faculty, a perceptual awareness event, and this awareness event bears that object's form. So it resembles the form. My pot perception has somehow a mental representation, a form, some say an image, so that's a bit of a problematic visual metaphor. It has a form of the object. It bears a certain likeness or resemblance to that external object which caused the perception. Perception is not an activity that is performed by an agent, such as the self on an object. This is a theory that Dharmakirti, as well as his predecessor Dignaga, explicitly reject. Now, a consequence of this theory for dealing with absences is that an absence has no causal capacity and it therefore cannot generate a perception of itself. This means that negativity or negative conceptual content is known through inference. In other words, inference is the only possible pramana that can deal with negativity. Okay. Kumarila's theory of absence as a knowledge instrument had a recognizable impact on Dharmakirti. And we can see this in Dharmakirti's earliest work on logic and epistemology. This is the so-called Pramanavartika Svavarti, the first chapter of his Pramanavartika, comprised of verses and prose, where he articulates the earliest form of his logical theory. And here he comes to discuss his own special type of inferential evidence for negative conceptual determinations, and this is called anupalabdhi, or non-apprehension. And he starts out with discussing it in general, in a form that is not yet concisely defined as a type of evidence in his logical theory. And he does so, I think, because he engages with Kumarila. He refers to this non-apprehension and characterizes it as the inactivity of knowledge instruments, pramananam apravartihi. Now, the fact that knowledge instruments in general are not active with regards to an object, this merely produces a person's inactivity, conceptual, verbally, or physically, with regard to what is currently non-existent for them. This is a kind of a, shall we say, very cautious and very almost sort of exclusive definition. You can do something with that. You can know something when pramanas are not active with regards to an object. But you cannot really fully determine a non-existence. You cannot have a conclusive knowledge of non-existence. And I will explain to you in a minute why Dharmakirti thinks this is the case. Here I only want to point out that this idea of the inactivity of knowledge instruments is very close to Kumarila's definition of the knowledge instrument absence, the non-arising of perception and other knowledge instruments. Secondly, when he first deals with the theory of non-apprehension in this, his earliest logical work, he very soon and unexpectedly deals with the problem of how to establish non-apprehension as an inferential evidence. Recall that I explained to you earlier how Kumarila raises this problem that if you assume the non-arising of pramanas counts as inferential evidence, you end up with an infinite regress. So this is a problem that has already arisen. And Dharmakirti very unexpectedly deals with this problem applying to his theory of non-apprehension and tries to explain why he is not guilty of this fallacy. And this, I think, can also be explained through an influence on the part of Kumarila. Okay, so far for a little bit of historical relationship. Now, Why is non-apprehension restricted for Dharmakirti? Not apprehending an object in general, through some kind of pramana, can, according to Dharmakirti, possibly negate its existence. It can make you convinced that the object is not known to exist. And that is because determining as existent would presuppose apprehending it. Okay, so if you have not apprehended it, you might get something out of that. The question whether this general form of non-apprehension is inferential evidence is actually difficult to decide. Some Tibetan authors actually turn this into a form of evidence. And I simply want to highlight this, that this is a little bit disputed in the tradition. For Dharmakirti, I think it's quite clear that it is not really, it's not the real deal. If you want to know non-existence, you can do so only under very restricted circumstances. This only applies when you do not apprehend an object through perception, not through any kind of other pramana, and only in a situation when it is true that if the object actually existed, it would necessarily be perceived. And this results from a certain tendency of Dharmakirti to want utmost certainty, and from his particular theory of perception as being the only knowledge instrument that has a direct and immediate causal relationship with the existence of its object. He restricts, in other words, non-apprehension to a form of non-perception that applies to objects which are perceptible in a sense of a necessary perceivedness. Now, this is a little bit difficult to grasp. It means you can determine a pot as absent in front of you if you know that the pot is the type of object that can, in principle, produce a perception of itself. It's not a ghost, and you know which causes are needed for it to produce a perception of itself, like the visual sense. And all the other causes for perceiving that pot are there. In other words, you can be sure that it's not the case you don't perceive a pot because you're blind. That would not determine its non-existence. Let me illustrate this. You have the perception of a pot, you have a set of causes that, when assembled, directly and immediately generate the awareness of the pot. It is only when you do not perceive a pot, it is only when all these other elements are present, and you know that the pot has been perceived before, you know that it's in principle perceptible, that you can be sure that the pot is absent. So this is maximum certainty that you can achieve. And this would be useful in situations, as Dhammottara illustrates it, the practical behavior aspect is when you want to walk on a piece of ground, and you're not quite sure from your vision whether there is some kind of obstacle lying there that would cause you to trip and to fall, then you would carry out a negative inference, and you would establish the absence of a pot in front of you. So this would be the object of activity, would actually be the existing object. So negation and negative determination here acquires a sense of exclusion. That's quite interesting from a philosophical point of view. Okay. Recall Kumarila's pattern, the argument from ignorance, which assumes that when you don't know when you don't apprehend an object through all the available knowledge instruments, you end up in a situation where you can be certain it doesn't exist. And that's absence as a knowledge instrument. Dhammakirti would not accept this as a kind of argument that is part of his logical theory. And he argues against this and excludes sort of cases that are not so strictly defined as the pot example, for various reasons. He argues that a general non-apprehension by all persons, if you were to argue something is not apprehended by anyone and therefore it doesn't exist, that's not a valid argument, because this general non-apprehension is not known to yourself in a particular person. You can never be sure that nobody really apprehends something. Not apprehending remote objects through perception, inference, or scriptural statements is not evidence for their non-existence, because they might exist yet not produce an awareness of themselves. So remoteness, or viprakrishta is the term that he uses, is a special type. It refers to things that are remote in place, in time, but also in nature. If you think of certain ghosts that cannot be perceived by ordinary persons, but they're presumably perceived by other ghosts, that's fine, but they are sort of remote and not accessible to our cognitive faculties. Not apprehending an object through a scriptural statement is also not evidence for its non-existence, because scripture is purpose-driven. Yeah? The fact that something is not mentioned in a scripture doesn't tell you it's non-existent, because a scripture is composed for a particular purpose. It wants to convey something that is relevant for that particular purpose. So something might simply not be mentioned there because it's not relevant. Okay. This leads to a fallacy of inconclusiveness. Yeah? When you do not apprehend an object through some knowledge instrument, the object might still exist, but simply have failed to give rise to its knowledge because there is no direct causal relationship, or because factors such as relevance or purpose in the case of scriptural statements are not there. Okay, I come to my last point, which I will only mention relatively briefly and in its general philosophical characteristic, and that is, for Dharmakirti, non-apprehension as a type of reliable inferential evidence is defined as another perception. Yeah? It is not actually the absence of perception. And now recall that circularity problem that I mentioned earlier. Yeah? When you understand non-apprehension as the absence of an apprehension, and the only way to know about an absence is non-apprehension, you need a further inference of non-apprehension, etc., etc. Yeah? Dharmakirti solves this problem, as well as a number of other philosophical problems, by simply assuming that non-perception is another perception. So when we speak of the non-apprehension of a pot, we mean nothing else than the fact that an existing empty piece of ground, a second object, is actually perceived. Okay. I think I will skip the other parts in the interest of time, but important here is a certain tendency of explaining away negativity and abscesses on the level of perceptual awareness and existence. So this idea that reality really is exhaustively defined as existence, and so that the absence of one thing is really nothing over and above the existence of another object, this relationality. Okay. So I have a little summary to recall. On the one hand, the contrast between Kumarila and Dharmakirti. On the issue of negative facts, they clearly stand in opposite groups. For Kumarila, there are negative facts, there is a reality of abhava, and that is required for distinction, meaning to explain the difference between real entities. For Dharmakirti, this is not the case. You only have existing real entities out there. And if you think of their difference, that does not warrant the postulation of a separate type of reality as abhava. That's just conceptually construed. Yeah? Whether there is a separate knowledge instrument accounting for negative facts consequently also divides them. For Kumarila, yes. For Dharmakirti, no. But for Dharmakirti, Anupalapti is nevertheless a special type of inferential evidence. So in the realm of logical reasons, you have a special domain that is responsible for negative conceptual determinations. Now, some distinctive features of their approaches that are not necessarily a contrast, but simply part of their general philosophical outlook. We see that in Kumarila, absence as a knowledge instrument has a sphere of application in the argument from ignorance, proving that other principles do not exist, over and above accounting for difference in reality. His approach is decidedly realist. The assumption is that if something is an element of cognition, if you have negativity in cognition, there must be something out there that corresponds to it. Dharmakirti's purpose is, from a theoretical viewpoint, simply to account for negative conceptual determinations. This was his theory of Anupalapti as negative inferential evidence is therefore. And I think it's also important to note that in his approach, this extremely restrictive approach, that you can't really have a wide range of negative determinations that apply to all sorts of things, that this perhaps is expressive of a certain tendency in his case to define a logical theory that fulfills maximum conditions for certainty. Okay, I will end here, and if you want some literature references, there is a link to a PDF in the presentation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for the really remarkable presentation. I just wanted a bit more, I wanted to understand a little better the final point you made on Dharmakirti's section, where you were talking about the manner in which he restricts the scope of entities to their existence.
Yeah.
I didn't fully understand what was meant in that point. So.
Could you repeat that again?
You made this point where the function of Anupalapti and Dharmakirti seemed to restrict entities, or I don't really understand, to their being existent, or to restrict?
To restrict the function of negative inferences to proving the absence, or establishing a conceptual determination of absent only for perceptible entities, actually. And by perceptible, what is meant is a very specific sense. Only entities that, if they existed here and now in the situation, it's also a very situational understanding, I think. Only those entities that, if they existed here and now, it is true that they would necessarily be perceived. Mm-hmm.
Yes, no, that was clear.
Okay.
But if there was, could you open the, it was in Dharmakirti, in the Dharmakirti section, the final...
okay, let me just try to get away from the chat. Okay, and the Dharmakirti section.
I think it was the final slide where, yes, so the relation, perception. Okay, I can't find it right now. There was a specific point, I'll think about it a little better and I'll maybe ask you another time.
Okay. Sorry. Let me just see what's in the chat. Somebody requested the QR code for the presentation again. I will bring it up shortly, but let me first... Yeah, somebody wants to know who the person is responsible to sign the document of attendance. I guess that's a question that is not really directed to me. The idea whether there is an idea of Maya and non-apprehension, a Shunyata theory of Buddhism, no. I don't really see that, and the theory of non-apprehension that I was referring to actually has no specific relationship to Shunyata. Okay, good.
Oh, both of those. Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Birgit, for this great overview. My question comes to is basically about how do you limit what's absent? This should be a problem both for Dharmakirti and Kumarila, in theory, I think, because when Dharmakirti says there's no pot here, there's a basically infinite number of things that are there. So what's his strategy for basically limiting it just to one certain thing? Is the expectation of the agent or something like that? I don't really know. And then Kumarila, I know he criticizes Dignaga's Apoha theory for positing an infinite number of absences and differences, actually. Mm-hmm. And I don't quite see if you say that absence for him is a positive, some fact in its own right, and then I must somehow think that differences also are like extra qualifiers of things. I'm not quite sure if that's correct. Then how does he himself get out of this? I know that he raises it as a criticism against other schools.
Yes.
So I think they're related, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a very good question. If you have if you think of a cow, and a cow is non-existent as a horse, but it's also non-existent as an eagle, as a chair, and as all sorts of other things. So do you have to assume all these absences? Is there an infinite number of absences in any given real thing? I think that's a legitimate criticism. I am really not sure how Kumarila would respond to that. An avenue for responding is simply saying there is some kind of absence as a general feature of a non-existent thing, which then becomes concretized in an individual cognitive process where the cognizer's interest creates a certain focus. I'm interested in distinguishing cows from horses because, I don't know, for whatever practical reason I might have. You want to milk? Yeah. Or you want to exclude that it's a horse, so you don't have to sell it. or you don't. You want to exclude that it's a horse because you want to know whether you can ride on it. Yeah, something like that. So that might be a possibility, but it might then also raise a criticism from the part of somebody who does not accept absences as a reality, because if you go so far as to require a concretization that comes through cognitive content, why not go all the way and say there are only existent things, and absence, the absence of something else, is equally just a epistemic sort of mental imposition. Yeah. So I don't think he actually responds to that potential criticism. And in case of Dharmakirti, I'm partial to Dharmakirti, of course, because I study Dharmakirti more. I think, however, that in a kind of a theory of like Dharmakirti's, you might have a better chance to preempt this possibility, because then absence is really just a conceptual thing, and yeah, you have a very parsimonious ontology to begin with. Having said that, there is a criticism, because, and I should mention that, because the assumption that Dharmakirtians make is you always determine an absence in relationship to some actually existing thing. Yeah? But actually, you also need for that the property that this thing is given in isolation, in separation, or without something else. Yeah? And this withoutness needs some kind of reality. And this would be what realists assume as the reality of abhava. Yeah? So there's a difference whether you determine a place or a place on its own. And the on its own is the absence of abhava. So as soon as you add the on its own, some realists argue, you smuggle in a reality of abhava through the back door. Okay.
So, thank you very much for this very interesting introduction to, it was very helpful for me. Well, I have to say one thing, the argumentum ad ignorantiam. So I myself had a change of heart, because I wrote an article about this, one version of it, the one of the Anupalabdhi, in the sense of like non-perceiving the self, while you perceive the aggregates, so the psycho-physical components of the individual. And originally I called it an argumentum ad ignorantiam, and then I realized that that was a logical fallacy, so I changed it back to what I believe it was the non-perception argument, that it was already used by Tabor anyways, talking about this Udyotakara, Vasubandhu, then Udyotakara debate. My question would be, in which sense perhaps this use of Anupalabdhi in this case, particularly I can think of Kamalashila onward, non-perception in the sense of, in particular in this argument, more of an application, another way of saying that there is no sadhaka pramana. So there is no, it's the negation of a sadhaka pramana, because this seems to be what Kamalashila is saying, is like, okay, Udyotakara wants to prove, yeah, you can prove it through direct perception, while you, through the hamkara, through the sense of I. Yes. When you think I, you think of the self. And he says, no, this is not actually, there is no sadhaka pramana, there is no proving means of whatever, source of knowledge or instrument of knowledge, right knowledge, because you don't actually perceive the self, but there is a non-apprehension, well, in that place, let's say place, where we are expected to perceive the self, you actually are perceiving the skandhas. So something that, if it existed, should be there, but you're perceiving actually another thing, which is the skandhas, right? Yeah. So there is a use of, of course there is a use of an Anupalabdhi, Dharmakirti and Anupalabdhi conception of the thing, but in a sense of like, it's used, but in the sense of denying the presence of a sadhaka pramana on the opponent's part. So in a way, is one of the, as usual, according to me, there are many arguments that sort of like converge to prove one point, but there is no, maybe hardly I found myself a case where one argument is enough, you know?
Yes, well, I mean, all these, thank you, all these philosophical discussion usually involve larger argumentation patterns, extended arguments. I think that's a very good and interesting point, because one does find such Anupalapti arguments in later Buddhist works, Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, that on some understanding of Dharmakirti shouldn't be there. Yeah? It's clearly, if you want to argue that there is no self because it's not apprehended by any pramana, and then you go through it, you can't do it with a Drishya Anupalapti reason, with this non-specific type of the non-perception of a perceptible. Yeah, that's obvious, I think. What this pattern actually is and how it is to be analyzed is, I think, a more difficult question. On the one hand, you could align such patterns with what I characterize as Dharmakirti's general understanding of non-apprehension that leads to not knowing that something exists. Yeah? So here, note the negation is different. Not knowing that something exists is not the same as knowing that it doesn't exist. Yeah? So you deny the epistemic predicate. Yeah? However, I'm not sure whether Shantarakshita and Kamalashila would say that by arguing against the self, they have only shown that the others have no way to prove them, to prove it exists. Yeah? They've only shown that there is no real good reason to believe in the self. I'm rather sure they would say, well, we actually are pretty sure that it doesn't exist, the self. Yeah? And we think we can prove that through these non-apolapti arguments, somehow. And that's, I think, where you get a little bit into a problem with Dharmakirtian logical theory. At least there is some tension there.
If there are no further questions, I would like to take a glance into your laboratory and to ask something about the concrete work on texts. It might not be known to most of our fellows or students of the Institute who are not specifically studying the subjects, that many Sanskrit texts had been brought to Tibet when Buddhism was introduced to Tibet, and many of those texts are today in the China Tibetology Research Center, and Vienna is a special place where those texts can be studied due to an agreement with the center in China. Do you have new texts that have not been studied until now, and had they been relevant for the subject that you exposed today?
Well, I mean, thank you for this question. I mean, in general, we are dealing here with a large quantity of Sanskrit manuscripts that were historically preserved in Tibet, where they were brought between the 8th and 14th century, and where now, I think the numbers that float around are 60,000 folios, yeah, so that's huge. And these manuscripts exist, the originals exist in monasteries and institutions in the Tibetan highlands. And in various ways, these have been reproduced. And what the China Tibetology Research Center in Beijing has is a certain part in photocopy that were made in the 1980s, late 1980s, I think. The Austrian Academy of Sciences has a cooperation agreement with that center to access these particular photocopies and for joint research and publication. The University of Naples also has a cooperation agreement with them, and we focus on different types of texts, different types of literature. The field of Buddhist epistemology has profited, is one of the two domains that has benefited extensively from these new discoveries. Because for Dharmakirti in particular, this is the first time that some of his works are attested in Sanskrit at all. Yeah. And actually, tantric literature is the second main domain where the benefits, the harvest has been particularly productive. And actually this year, I think we will celebrate the historical moment that for the first time in modernity, scholarship has access to all of Dharmakirti's major philosophical works in Sanskrit. Because the last one, the last edition, is currently being finalized. Yeah. So yes, a number of Dharmakirti's works. I studied initially, I wrote my dissertation on Anupalapti, and one of Dharmakirti's main works, the Pramana Vinishchaya, that we also heard about yesterday, has been available in Sanskrit only since the 2000s, and has been edited by different chapters, Ernst Steinkellner, Pascal Hugon. Yeah, so it has had an impact.
Thank you, Birgit, very much. Also very nice PowerPoint. I'm envious. So if there are no other questions, I'm not even sure if this is working. I want to thank you, Professor Kellner, for this amazing presentation, and then I'll introduce you our next speaker. Okay, yes. Yeah, we all need 5 minutes, I think. Okay, welcome back for our second speaker, Professor Francesco Sferra. He also needs a little introduction. Well, first of all, he's the professor of Sanskrit and Sanskrit language and literature at the University of Napoli L'Orientale. And he is one of the major experts in Buddhist tantrism, and also he's been working on philosophy and especially Shaiva texts, Kashmirian Shaiva text, and some Buddhist philosophy as well. He has an extensive and impressive number of publications, so it's, I'll cut it short in this regard. And with no further delay, I introduce him and I ask him to please begin.
So thank you, Serena, for your kind introduction. Hope that you have no much expectations about my talk. For your kind words are always a bit embarrassing. Anyway, I would like to thank you, Serena, and you, Wolfgang, for having organized this event and for inviting me. Thank you too for coming, and also people online. The aim of my presentation is to give you a brief overview of how time has been conceived in some of the main intellectual traditions of South Asia. Therefore, my presentation does not present the results of extensive research. I do, however, hope that it may prove useful in providing food for thought and as a starting point for further exploration. Let's start by saying that Sanskrit has many terms for time. Maybe the slide. Yes, we have some words. We have kala, samaya, vela are the three main words, but there are many others. We have also terms for time divisions. One important term is kshana, but there are others because kshana is, in some traditions, certainly in Buddhism, is the shortest measure for time, the smallest unit of time. In other traditions, we have other words even, but just summing up, just collecting more kshanas, at some point, you have another unit, which is tat kshana, for instance. In general, they say 120 kshanas are one kshana, a tat kshana. And what is a kshana? Here too we have different definitions. I remember one, which is, if I remember well, from a Jaina text. Sorry, I don't remember now which text, which defines kshana in terms of the time that an atom has to revolve around its axis. So then we should start again. Okay, how much is the time for that? Okay, let's take this for granted. Okay, one kshana is in theory very, 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 very little. And then we have 120 of one kshana, and then according to texts, for instance, either 60 or 120 takshanas, so double, it depends on texts. We have one lava, and then 30 lavas are one muhurta, and here we can say approximately 48 minutes or something like that. It was just to say that there are several words. Most important for us are kala. That's why it's in red. Kala is the term most commonly used to refer to time in general, and it is the one most frequently found in philosophical and theological literature. Samaya, which can be a synonym, but most often refers to the right time or the right moment for doing anything, or even the opportunity, occasion, or season for doing anything. Vela refers instead to a specific period of time, or even to a particular phase of the day. Just as in other cultures, in the Indian subcontinent too, reflections on time have very ancient origins. Time is seen first and foremost as the fundamental reality, the source from which everything comes and to which everything returns. Here there is just one example, a quotation from Mahabharata. The entire universe, existence and non-existence, pleasure and pain, is rooted in time. Time ripens beings, time destroys creatures. Time, again, extinguishes time, which is burning creatures. Time is what remains awake when everything else is asleep, and the guiding principle behind all activity. Here too we have just a few quotations. You see from the Paramasamhita is a Vaishnava work of more or less Middle Ages, perhaps 8th or 9th century. And there we have a famous word, Kala Chakra, but has nothing to do with the Buddhist Kala Chakra tradition. Here Kala Chakra is in the more common sense. The even more frequent usage of the term is just horoscope, but here not. Just Kala Chakra is again an epithet. What is Kala Chakra? And then Brahma asks for clarification, and the answer is, again, time creates beings, time destroys creatures. You see the same line as above. And then in blue, time remains awake among all those who sleep. Indeed, time is insurmountable. Time divides every goal of humans, be it high or low. Then the past, the present, and the future all proceed from time. Time as if it were before time distinctions in the famous three times of past, present, and future. Just this is an introduction, sorry. It's a quite, in a sense, more just to contextualize what I want to say later. So the guiding principle behind all activity, and even the gods are subject to time. Here we have another quote. Just we can read the red part. Once they become subject to the order it has imposed, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, the other gods and demons are unable to transgress it. In light of these quotations, it comes as no surprise that over time, time itself has come to be regarded as a divine entity. Here, just collected a few quotes, a couple of from Shaiva works. Bhairava Rupi Kalaha, you see in red, just at the top. So, time as the nature or as the form, literally, of Bhairava. Bhairavi is a famous epithet of Shiva, is the tremendous, terrifying. So he emits the cosmos or the universe up to, from the main causes, let's say, up to just insects. Similar idea later in another work, Maheshvara, I am Maheshvara, the great Lord Maheshvara, I am Kala, I am time. I'm just reading the red part. I am the generator of time. And again, the generator of time, perhaps I was wrong in putting the capital T in the second case. Maybe this should have been short. I, time with a capital T, I am the generator of time with a short t, intending the division of time, the units of time, the time that we can perceive. These are clearly Shaiva works, but then we have a similar expression. Again, if you look, it's quite interesting because it tells us something about the reuse of sentences or even stock phrases or even long passages sometimes from one tradition to another. And here we have, again, Kalaha Srijati Bhutani Kalaha Sankharate Sada. Very similar, if not identical, with one of the previous quotes in bold. In a Buddhist text instead. This is a Buddhist work. Kalohi Bhagavan Vajri. So Vajrin is the Vajra holder, is another way to say Buddhahood embodied. Say Buddha, the nature of Buddha. Buddha, whose nature is Ahoratra, so day and night, also just common time, is the Bhagavat, is what we translate sometimes the Blessed One, even though maybe it's more complex than that, but let's leave this. The Bhagavat, the Blessed One, the Vajra holder is time. So we have time becomes an attribute, even not identical with Shiva, the Buddha, or Buddhahood if you want, and maybe, yes, no, it's here, there is not a slide, but I have just a translation. I want to about to conclude the introduction. I shall read you a very evocative poetic passage taken from a supremely famous text, the Bhagavad Gita. Certainly the colleagues know very well this, but maybe some of, let's say, postdocs present here that come from Western side maybe are not so familiar. So it's taken from chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter that describes the epiphany of Vishnu. Now I'm Shiva, then the Buddha, then let's see one example with Vishnu. The passage begins with Arjuna's words of wonder. Arjuna is dialoguing with Krishna, that Krishna now in chapter 11 manifests himself as in his supreme form, and that is to say, as Vishnu in his fullness. And Arjuna says, just as the many rushing waves of rivers plunge headlong into the sea, so these heroes of the human world enter your flaming mouths, just as gnats rush headlong to fall into a blazing fire and perish, so they rush headlong to fall into your jaws and perish. From every quarter you gradually lick up and devour all the worlds with your flaming mouths, O Vishnu. May your terrible rays of light fill and burn the entire universe. Tell me who you are, you who reveal yourself to me in such a terrible form. Praise be to you, the greatest of the gods. Please show compassion. I wish to know you as you were before. Truly, I do not understand your ways. The Blessed One said, I am time, the destroyer of the worlds, the ancient one, and here I labor to devour the worlds. But there is an even older passage with which it's worth concluding this introductory section. It's taken from the Atharva Veda. The Atharva Veda is a very ancient text, and it devotes two hymns, even two hymns to time. Time drives a chariot to which is yoked, a horse with 7 reins. It has 1,000 eyes, knows no old age, and has many seeds. The wise seers ascend upon it. The wheels of this chariot are all beings. The chariot of this time has 7 wheels, 7 axles. Immortality is truly its axis. He is the one who brings about the appearance of all these beings. Time is truly the first God. We perceive it existing in various forms. Time, which they said was in the supreme space, stands before all beings. Certainly, it sustains beings, it surrounds beings. Though a father, it became their son. Therefore, there is in reality no higher power. Time begot that sky above and brought forth these lands. That which has been and that which will be dwells and moved in time. Time manifested the earth, in time the sun worms, in time are all these beings, in time the eye looks around, in time is placed the mind, in time is the breath of life, in time the name. For the time to come all these creatures rejoice. In time is placed our ardor, in time that which is principle, in time the sacred verses, that is to say, the Vedas. This is the Lord of all. It was the father of Prajapati, the progenitor. By time, the world was set in motion. By time, it certainly arose. In time, it is fixed. Time is Brahman. Time sustains the supreme being, which probably here is Agni. Okay, this was just for a premise, in a sense, but with the emergence of philosophical schools, theories of time or on time became more clearly defined. Let me really summarize in a quite abrupt way. I beg your pardon for this, but just as I said you at the beginning, I want to give you some glimpses, and then this might be a food for just further inquiry. Time as a substance. This is what probably, not probably, it was certainly the Nyaya and Vaisheshika among the main, among others, have believed, or believe still. Time is a substance, is a dravya, as we'll see in a moment. Time as an activity is a Samkhya main description of time. Time as insubstantial, this is a Buddhist viewpoint. Time as power is not every Shaiva think this way, but most of medieval Shaiva traditions have this idea. Then the problem is, what is the place of power if power is is part of the ultimate, or if power is just another aspect of reality, not to be compared with the ultimate. But this is another point. Okay, according to Nyaya, time is a substance, dravya, as you see there. It is what determines the concept of past, present, and future. Its kala is atita adi vyavahara hetuhu kala. Kala is the cause for the, let's say, use, vyavahara in this case perhaps, of linguistic use or a practical idea about and so on, of past and so on. Atita adi. Sacha eko, vibur, nityascha. And then there are 3 qualifications. One, it is indivisible, but applies to everything. It's omnipresent and eternal. Since there is only one time, the 3 divisions of time, so atita, vartamana, and bhavishyat, as you see in the slide, are due to upadis. Upadis, this term means just limiting conditions. It depends on limiting conditions. But actually time is just one omnipresent and eternal dravya. But how can we know time? According to the Nayayikas, time is atindriya. So atindriya is a Sanskrit word which means beyond sense faculties. Ati, beyond, and indriya, sense faculties. Other schools, the Prabhakaras that have been mentioned before, and the Advaitins here mainly means Advaita Vedantins, and even some grammarians believe that it is instead the opposite, Indriya Vidya. Perceivable by sense faculties. Okay, let's try to investigate just a little the viewpoint of the Nayayikas. Okay, time is beyond the sensory faculties. What proof do we have of its actual existence as a substance, apart from, of course, what scriptures may say? We have just seen a passage from the Atharva Veda. I don't know if they were thinking of that passage, but time we could consider as just demonstrated by some testimony, or authoritative testimony, and for them, Shabda or Aptavachana, authoritative statements can be a proof of knowledge. Apart from these, of course, but if you want to be really to be grounded on more at a more epistemic level, so how can we demonstrate? In theory, in accordance with the fundamental principle of the Indian system of classification, any adequate proof of the existence of time should also serve as proof of its exclusive capacity to perform a specific function. So we can think of time as the static framework against which events unfold. Its function, we might say, is to act as a support. The Nayayikas maintain that time does not fall within the realm of external perception because it lacks specific qualities such as smell, color, so it cannot be perceived by external senses. And it is not the object of internal perception either, because the mind has no jurisdiction over external non-psychic objects that have not first come into contact with a sense faculty. So we don't have ground either outside, either inside to perceive, according to Nayayikas, time. Consequently, according to the Nayayikas, knowledge of time is derived from a series of inferences. The logical basis for inferring the existence of time is provided by concepts such as proximity and non-proximity, or distance if you want, paratva, aparatva, simultaneity and succession, speed and slowness. So using these as logical marks, we can infer the existence of time. And since proximity, distance, and so on can only be determined in relation to something else, we need a point of reference to apply those. And since to avoid falling into tautology, we cannot rely on time itself, we must consider a relationship with something external. Eventually, it seems to be simple, but the revolution of the sun. Something external, so a star, the sun. Of course, we can draw on other forms of reasoning-based evidence. We might say that time is a prerequisite for the principle of causality, and that we experience effects arising from specific causes. And the cause and effect have to belong to different units, if you want, different units, we say, of time. So we demonstrate time indirectly this way. We also experience change in the world around us and within ourselves. The Nayayikas' viewpoint has been criticized by representatives of other traditions. The Nayayika conception is based on the assumption that time is a category external to the knowing subject. The radically opposite view is that we do not, in fact, need inferences to demonstrate the existence of time. Time is, according to some authors, Bhartrihari is one of them, is a defining element of every experience. Time is a visheshana, is a qualifier, literally a qualifier, something which qualifies something else, a visheshya. Proponents of this view argue that if time were not immediately perceptible, so the indriya vidya of the previous slide, we could not perceive slowness or simultaneity, for example. According to these authors, we don't need to resort to the sun or the revolution of the sun. The grammarian Nagesha, 17th, 18th century, according to him, our normal perception of an object is invariably associated with the conviction of its presence, which is a temporal determination. Sustained awareness of the object is associated with the perception of the duration of this perceptual event. So it's, in some way, time or temporality is a characteristic of the experience itself. That's why they can, those who uphold this viewpoint, they say it is indriya vidya. According to Samkhya, time is not a separate, independent, and absolute category. So we have another possibility. We have another way of thinking time, just which I briefly mentioned. We'll come back on this later, perhaps. It is a derived entity that is identified with action itself. So now this is just a sentence from Yukti Deepika, a Samkhya commentary on the Samkhya Karikas. Nahi nah kalo namakaschit padarto asti. So there is no category called time for us. And then later they say kala kriya. So the time is nothing but to be identified with action. The other perspective with time was intrinsic in, say, the knowledge, the perception of an object, or if you want, in experience. Maybe we can use a wider word. But it is also just the action itself. Every action can be described as action. Indeed, needs temporal sequence to be performed. Action is another way to speak about time, according to Samkhya. Some Buddhist traditions have held views similar to the substantialist position of Nyaya or to that of the Samkhya. But in mainstream Mahayana, time is generally conceived as insubstantial. The earliest critique of time in a Mahayana text is found in the 6 verses of chapter 19 of the Madhyamaka Karika, which I will read the translation here, but I want first just summarize its topic. It's not easy passage, as ever, Nagarjuna. So we are in a quite early, so in 2nd century. The text is in Nagarjuna's characteristic style, constructed to dismantle any definition of time, any definition in general, but in this case of time, that rests on identifying it as an independent reality. In opposition to the Sarvastivada, so schools that held a similar Nyaya-like, if you want, view, in opposition to the Sarvastivada, the first 4 verses aim to demonstrate that the illogicality of the real existence of temporal divisions. If temporal divisions depend on one another, they would all exist simultaneously. But this is clearly illogical. This is the content of verse 1. If temporal divisions are independent of one another, they are not simultaneous but completely unconnected. And the lack of connection between the time divisions is illogical too. Consequently, time divisions do not exist. In stanza 5, Nagarjuna examines the concept of time in itself, independent of its 3 dimensions. He engages with 2 theories. The first of the 2 maintains that time is identical to the units. So we can identify time with kshanas, or with kshana, muhurtas, lava, takshana, and so on and so forth, by which we measure it. So time is nothing but the units by which we measure it. The defect that Nagarjuna identifies in this theory is that, in this case, time is a continuous flow, and there is no way to apprehend it or make it the object of reflection or actual measurement. The other hypothesis, again in stanza 5, is that time is absolute and unchanging, an entity that completely transcends the units of measurement we attribute to it. Time would thus be entirely stable, with neither beginning nor end. This theory too, however, is untenable because in that case time would lie entirely beyond our experience and cognitive capacity. The final stanza considers the possibility that time is a property of things. Things would thus form the substratum of time. However, things do not exist in themselves. They are empty, as we know in the Mahayana mainstream. The non-existence of things implies the non-existence of time. So let me now read the translation of these verses, which they're a bit cryptic, but perhaps with my introduction should be now slightly more clear. Of course, I speak for those who are really very new to this field of studies, not for colleagues. In the present and the future dependent on, if the present and the future depended on the past, then the present and the future would exist in the past. For if the present and the future were not to be found there, that is in the past, how could they, as present and future, be dependent on it? On the other hand, the present and the future cannot be regarded as independent of the past. In conclusion, the present and future tenses do not exist. By this same line of reasoning, the other two hypotheses, let's say translate this way, the remaining hypotheses are the present and past, past and future, can also be explained, as well as high, low, middle, etc., unity, etc. No variable time is perceived, nor is there any unchanging time that can be perceived. And how can one conceive of a time that is not perceived? If time depended on being, how could there be time without being? Indeed, there is no being. So how can there be time? Of course, I'm just running a bit, but this is just to give you an idea of a possible criticism from a Madhyamaka point of view and, let's say, Mahayana point of view of a substantialist view of time. Another well-known critique of the concept of time with Mahayana Buddhism was put forward by Shantarakshita and Kamalashila. This is in a chapter we are just reading these days with some friends, Professor Kyuma and Selzang, who is somewhere, somewhere there. Okay, another well-known critic. Yes, Shantarakshita, along with his pupil, examines and criticizes the views of some Sarvastivada masters who admit the existence of a permanent substance that enables the cognition of the past and the future. From this perspective, say, generally speaking, Sarvastivada, actually there are many sub-schools, and in fact, Shantarakshita and especially Kamalashila refers specifically to some names and describe, even though briefly, their viewpoints. So things are a bit more complicated than now I'm summarizing. There are various ways to, let's say, decline or describe this substantialist point of view. But in general, the idea is that knowledge of the past, present, and future is possible only if one posits that entities do not lose their continuity as substances. The distinction between past, present, and future states is conceived as possible on the basis, is conceived possible, I would say, on the basis of these entities. But we may ask, is the activity that these entities perform, and again we are using the word activity because time is connected with the activity, the change of that occurs or can occur in things, in dharmas, in dharmins. So is the activity they perform the same or different from the entity itself? So if the action which is responsible for present, future, and past is like a property that belongs to a property possessor, we should ask, is this the relationship between the two of identity or of difference? Is the property identical with the property possessor, or they are different? If it is the same as the entity, the property is the same, it should always exist, like the essence of the thing. And it would therefore be illogical to posit on that basis a temporal distinction in the past, of past, present, because if the entity is the, if this is a property that coincides with the essence of the thing, should always be the same. And we cannot have, let's say, the permanence of the nature of the thing going together with past, present, and future. We don't have the possibility to apply time distinctions in something which is permanent in itself, as the essence of something. If it is different, there is no longer a necessary link between the thing and the activity. And this contradicts experience. There is never an activity without a substratum. In conclusion, just to really to arrive at the conclusion, that the text is quite long and intricate, and we don't follow now all details. But in conclusion, time is a conceptual construct that cannot be logically demonstrated in relation to any substance. It's reduced to the subjective perception of the present, perhaps. So we can say this. So just another way to arrive at the same conclusion that Nagarjuna arrived in a different way some centuries before. But what to do with time? Is time a nice thing or is time a bad thing? Maybe we cannot do otherwise. Time is our experience. But it seems to me that Indian traditions in general just have a bad relation, maybe also Western traditions have a bad relationship with time. So there's one point that, I mean, the target is often to put an end to time. Time has to be quenched in some way, has to be stopped. And I'm not just superimposing, just what I see at least in two major traditions. I mean, let's say, generally speaking, really generally speaking, and I beg your pardon, especially the specialists here that may be not happy with that, but just Buddhism in general, just if I could say Buddhism in general, just a kind of blasphemy to say this, but please allow me. And in this case, Shaiva traditions, particularly the Kashmirian ones, they clearly speak of Kala Sankarshini, so the power of that devours time. So the target is at some point to stop time, to devour time, to interrupt time, to reabsorb time in some way. Time is connected with breathing in, breathing out. Time divisions can be also described in terms of number of breathing moments during a day. Should be 21,600, something like that, each one of some seconds, 4 seconds perhaps. And but this is not the problem. The problem is that breathing in, breathing out is in itself, of course, a dualistic activity. We have one in and one out, and we have dualism, dichotomy. So, and dichotomy means conceptual constructions. So conceptualization, let's say, the production of concepts of mental proliferations are in any case based on breathing and on time. If there were no breathing, there were, according to old texts, but just quoted somewhere and kept present also in later texts, medieval texts, the idea that breathing is the problem because breathing is unavoidably connected with conceptualization. Conceptualization, vikalpas, conceptual constructions, are the problem. Ideally, if we were able to have only direct perception of things, we would be awakened we would be liberated in a sense, because we would not have superimpositions on reality. We would perceive reality as it is. But it's impossible. If we want to live, we need to breathe. And breathing involves a kind of unavoidable problem. So what has to do a yogin, what has to do a practitioner of every tradition? Just to control in some way, or to put an end to conceptualization. Concepts have to be, a Buddha uses concepts. An advanced yogin uses concepts, but he or she knows how to use concepts. This is a big difference. The common person usually is just devoured by time. He's not the devourer of time. He's devoured by time. Time governs us in terms of thinking, in terms of mental proliferation. And this is something that is not positive for us. So if you are, let's say, a Buddha, you can use vikalpas, and you can use them as tools for teaching, tools for practical usage, for, let's say, what is needed to survive, what is needed to do things, to live. But if you are not able to overcome vikalpas or conceptual constructions, you are just a servant of them, and you are a bound to transmigration person. So there are schools, traditions, which I will refer now just briefly, that try to make it explicit how we can overcome time. How we can overcome time, because this means how we can overcome conceptualization. Okay, so let me refer first to the Shaiva idea of power. According to the Shaivas, in this case, all Shaivas, also the so-called dualist Shaivas, they have the idea of Kala as one of the powers. They make power. According to the so-called Kashmir Shaivas, those who have a kind of Advaita perspective, so non-dualist perspective, Kala is indeed one of the powers that, together with a set of other powers, sometimes they are 6, other times 5, other times only 4, is one of the powers that can be used by, or that are used by the limited agent, so let's say the souls, the individuals, to recover a part of the absolute powers. So if you say, just to simplify things very much, if Shiva is omnipotent, a soul, let's say an individual soul, has a limited capacity to act, limited agency. And this is kind of called kanchuka, which is chorus. It's an armor. It's something that helps or permits the soul to to be partly preserved from samsara. So it just has some power that makes this person, the soul, to be slightly freer than a complete deterministic will. It's beyond that, just in part because it has some powers. So limited capacity to be agent, but it's also something that prevents to be liberated completely. Otherwise, it would be, or she would be, omnipotent. So we have limited agency, limited knowledge, attachment, time. Time is one of those powers. As I said to you before, we cannot but live if you want, unless we want to commit suicide. So if you want to get rid of vikalpa, we have in any case to use vikalpas. Vikalpas are, in some way, part of our life. So we have to manage. We have to find a way to use vikalpas in order to, overcome vikalpas, as one of the first quotes I read at the beginning. Time destroys time. this is the idea. Time destroys time, but according to this perspective, the Shiva one, since this is one power that we have in common with Shiva, and perhaps according to some schools, we are Shiva. There is no real difference between Shiva and us, as there is no difference between Shiva and this table. There is no problem, there is no gap about the talk this morning. There is no gap between what is conceptuality and non-conceptuality. Even the non-conceptuality, even pure awareness, even the pure awareness which is equal to direct perception, contains, according to these traditions, contains already conceptualization. It's already conceptualization. That's why we can have inference first, direct perception after. Because actually, we already have, at any level, even when there is pure I, pure consciousness without concepts, we already have actually conceptualization. In a condensed way, of course, not overt. But the yogin is able to move, is able to move from the pure, just awareness without apparent conceptualizations, is able to move to the opposite, the total use of conceptualization, total use of, but if we were talking about horses and riding horses, it's totally different if you are on the ground and the horse comes and runs above you, or if you are on the riding the horse. And the yogin is riding the horse of conceptualization. This is the idea. So that when we say Kala Samharshini, the power that reabsorbs time, which means that the yogin is now totally identified with consciousness, to the point that the yogin is able to perceive himself as Shiva himself, with all his powers, including the power of time, which means conceptualization. It's nothing but conceptualization, nothing but life. I don't want to say more on that. Maybe if you want, yeah, this was a passage, but we can move on. Okay, time, and breath, outside, internal, bahye, outside, adhyatmani, inside. So we have number of breaths. One day and one night is 2,600 shvasas, you see on the right of the slide. Half day, half of that, one juncture is another number, and so on and so forth. What is the target? This is something which I just have taken, it's common to many traditions, but I've taken from a text which is a Buddhist tantric text from the Middle Ages. They propose that to suppress time. This is a second strategy. The first strategy is to ride the horse. This is first strategy. I ride the horse. I accept that conceptualization is part of the one reality. Reality one. It's not true that we have dharma and dharmin. That's false. Just for the sake of talking among us. We divide a dharma and we have a dharmin. So property possessor, dharmin, and properties, dharmas. But it's just a substantialist way that cuts off what we could say a more holistic way of thinking. So actually we have only one reality, which is both things. Dharma and dharmin are the same reality. This is the idea, eventually, for the Shaivas and others. The idea is that we have only one reality that for the sake of clarity, at the didactic level, for understanding, in philosophical debate, we use. We can use the word computer, we can use the word glasses, because it's practical. But, so we can use dharmin and dharma, but we never have dharma and dharmin as two separate things. This was a strategy to just arrive at the core of unity of those things. And then be free or use whatever you want. Then another idea, possibility, suppression of time. We can suppress time. And we can suppress time through what do we have? Yoga. Yoga practices. Yoga practices that enable us to suppress breaths, to substitute breaths with, it's not strange for us now, maybe I don't know if you put the right word there. No, I put the wrong word, but just not incomplete, not wrong. Paramakshara kshanas, you see at the third column. Paramakshara kshanas. Instead, should be paramakshara jnana, is more common. But also kshana is attested. In fact, I copied from a text. The same tradition uses paramakshara jnana or jnana. So, instants of, or if you want kshanas, or let's say cognitions of unchanging cognitions or cognitions of the unchanging, understood pleasure, because the complete compound is paramakshara sukha jnana. Just also sukha is there, but it's not in this case, but paramakshara sukha jnana. So the awareness of, or awareness instant of the pleasure which is unchanging, because what is changing? Breathing in, breathing out, that's changing. But unchanging is when breathing stops. Breathing is stopped. And breathing is stopped and the supreme unchanging, so the supreme unchanging pleasure. So we have instants of akshara jnanas. Eventually they turn into, the target is paramakshara jnana, so the supreme at the end. So the suppression of some number of breaths, I don't know if you see there, I don't know if I have, anyway, you see in the third column there are some numbers. These are the numbers of breath movements during the day. So 3,600 movements are blocked. Okay, we reach a first level of progression, which in Mahayana Buddhism is technically called bhumi. Stage of spiritual progression. And to become a Buddha, it depends on traditions, you have to reach, say, 10 bhumis. According to other schools, 11. In this school, 12, because every school wants to have something more. They are even longer, as far as I know, longer series of bhumis. But here we have 12, and then to reach 12 bhumis, you have to suppress breaths. You have to suppress breaths during the yoga practice. Yoga practice which involves also sex, so sexual union, because some energy is to be involved. Some energy. It's not something that you can do easily, at least according to this tradition, the tradition of the Kala chakra in this case, and other, say, tantric Buddhist traditions which have similar kind of yoga, not so detailed as in the Kala chakra, I would say. So you have to suppress breaths, you have to retain the breath, and you have to acquire a stage of spiritual advancement up to reaching the final stage of blocking of 21,600 breaths and the end of time, at least for a while. And this experience, of course, changes the mind of the practitioner who has some kind of experience of non-duality. At that point, we are beyond conceptual constructions. Now, the question is, what happens after? I suppose that happens something similar to what the Shaivas would say. So then, as the Buddha continued to teach and to use language, also the liberated, the yogin, can continue to use vikalpas, conceptualization. So demonstrating in practice that the sharp distinction between vikalpa and avikalpa is just nonsensical. And then you can use vikalpas with a liberated mind. Probably it is the same. Maybe the description is completely different, maybe less smooth than it is in the Shaiva, according to my perspective. I can be wrong, because of course I'm not a super specialist of those things. And I hope that I've not provoked too much reaction on you, because I want to come back home safe. But I would interrupt here, hoping that some clues for just debate or just further investigation have been given to you. So thank you for your attention. Sorry.
Thank you for your informative and comprehensive lecture on the theme of time. Yeah, maybe you may know already, but the famous goddess Kali, the name of Kali could also be etymologically related to the noun Kala, especially in the context of Kashmir Shaiva. Do you have any additional comments on this issue?
No, not particularly. Of course, Kali is probably called that way because Kala means also dark or black. Mm-hmm. And Kali is black and terrifying aspect of the Shakti. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. Kali could also be the time.
Yes.
The time in feminine. Yes, could be. No, I don't have nothing in particular to say. Just we could add perhaps that in a Kashmir Shaiva perspective, the powers, again, like Dharmin and Dharma are the same thing, basically, ultimately the same thing, just for the play of the world. We can speak about Dharmin and Dharma. So Shakti and Shaktiman, or Shaktimat, are the same. Mm-hmm. And so we have read a few sentences from the Vayu Purana, from other medieval texts, where Kala is Vishnu, Kala is Maheshvara, Kala is even the Buddha. So I have no problems to imagine that Kala is a way, and then so Kali could be a way, legitimate way, to define the power. I mean, ultimate reality, sin from the point of view of time. We could also see the ultimate in terms of desire. So it would be not Kali, but Icha. We could see the ultimate in terms of knowledge. Call it Vidya. The ultimate can be described in terms of other powers. Like, let's say, for instance, the very interesting power of diminishing itself in order to create duality, that is the world, unnata. So if there were not the capacity to lessen itself into an inferior reality, to break the perfection of pure consciousness into a myriad of smaller entities called souls or even elements of the world. If there were no this capacity, we would not have the world simply, just the pure perfection of the Vedanta, which is just a pure sat, but totally insensitive. So Kali could be. I mean, I've never, frankly, found a clear definition of that. I do not exclude that it might exist, or they may play on that. But usually is the Kala Samkarshini is the name of the Shakti, which is connected with time. And then in the sense that she divorced time, because she is time. As the quotation at the beginning was saying, that I am Kala and I devour Kala. So time that divorced time. That's perhaps an answer. I'm not sure.
So another question is, about just a minor point. Could you go back to the slide with Bayou planners?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is
Quotation.
it? It does not work. Why does not work? Sorry. I'm not able to come back. It does not work any longer. Something has stopped here. I don't know.
To go back?
Yes, to go back because
You should just pick up and then should be able to go back again.
okay. No, I tried, but okay. Now it's going. Yes. Yes. Here, Bayou Purana, you said. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the third line, we have Aham Janu, Janaita. Actually, it sounds a little bit odd to me. We may expect Aham Janasya, or in the meaning of progenitor of creatures.
Yes. In fact, the translation below is just, I am the creature, I am the progenitor. So just a kind of oxymoron, if you want. So I am both things. I am both what is created and what creates, if you want. I don't know if the text is right, sorry. I've taken from any text, I have to confess, for simpleness, for quickness. But I agree, maybe some, in any case, Janasya would be metrically bad, so we cannot have Janasya there, but...
this might be Jantor, or...
yeah, could be.
Or Janas.
Yeah, could be.
Janas, Janaitri, Jano, Janaitri.
Yeah, could be. But it's not, if you remember the other quotation from the Atharva Veda, it said, even though I am the father, I became creature. I became the son. So it's not impossible also this idea that is both things, both what is created and both what creates. So I would not exclude that. The text is right, so at least it's
So
not
you think
impossible.
this reading is also possible?
No, I mean, I think it's possible. I'm not sure it is right, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah, in other places, Kara Srijati Bhutani.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And yes. Indeed.
Yeah, but you think this is also possible?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Francesco. That was very intriguing. I'm especially interested in this notion that breathing is linked closely to conceptual activity. And I have two questions related to that. First, I didn't quite understand the foundation relation between conceptual awareness episodes and breathing. So breathing would be the cause for it, or the other way around, basically?
No,
breathing is an expression, a result.
No, maybe I was not clear enough, sorry. Just I was speaking without following any longer my... Because I have always this figure, especially when I don't feel very well. If I follow this too much, people get bored. If I don't follow this, I get self-excited while speaking and skip some passages. The idea is that if you substitute, then I can also say the other part, but if you substitute the process of breathing with a moment of interruption of breathing, let's say interruption of activity, which means interruption of mental proliferation, and you substitute with the pure awareness, that jnana, pure awareness of what is there in that very moment, and I said it's connected with sexual pleasure in some way. If you are you have pure awareness of bliss, let's say, even though momentary as you like, and you substitute moment after moment conceptualization with non-conceptual experience of bliss which does not decay, because if the bliss decays, if it's lost, because you are not able to retain your sexual energy and it gets lost, if then the process starts again in the negative. But if you are able to retain this energy and you can keep awareness, pure awareness of the bliss, at that point sexual union has nothing to do with the normal, the common, laukika, worldly sexual union. It's just another thing, just another practice. At this point, you experiment that kind of non-conceptual awareness, say, of a Buddha, especially if you arrive at the end of the process, if you're able to arrive at the end of the process of a real interruption of time. In theory, for one day and one night. I mean, I don't know if it is physically possible, but the texts describe as if it were possible. So I don't know. We have to just refer what they say. Or maybe there is something not written there. Like, I don't know, sorry, just a small digression, which was in any case connected with that. The remembrance of previous lives. You should be able to remember previous lives. But is it possible in a moment, during the night of just the night before awakening, the Buddha should have experienced the remembrance of all his previous lives in one night? It's totally impossible. In fact, in the Visuddhimagga, it is explained how this practice has to be done. It's the only text, as far as I know, at least in Indic language. Maybe in Tibetan there is something else, but in Indic language it's the only one that I found so far, which describes the way you have to practice the remembrance of the previous lives. And it has to do every day a bit. Every day you remember, you start to remember what you have done today since this morning. Then you pause, it's time for dinner. You have a dinner, maybe tomorrow morning, as you wake up, you start remembering from day before yesterday, what you did the day before yesterday, and so on and so forth. Up to remember your birthday, up to remember your previous life. And then you go on, but this needs time. It's not real, that is no more. So I wonder if these practices to block the breathing in, breathing out for one day means that you are really to block. Probably something like that. It's not written. I guess that you practice the sexual yoga according to the dictates of this system for a while, then maybe another time for another while, and you acquire like a pilot of an aircraft that is judged on the basis of how many hours he has driven. Something like that, I guess, but I'm not sure, frankly. I have not experienced direct personal experience of this practice. So I cannot say, only what I guess. The principles are clear. Then the association of breathing with conceptualization is very old. It's very old. And it's very old, and you find of course, in the yoga tradition, but you also find in other yogic texts of the Middle Ages. And there's one chapter which is very clear on that. In the Tantra Sara of Abhinavagupta I don't remember which chapter on time, which should be either the 6th or the 9th, one of the two. In one of those chapters, there are a few pages in prose, not in poetry, in prose, but also in the Tantra Loka, he deals with this topic, quoting from sources. Mm-hmm. So there are sources, already ancient sources, that clearly state breathing is endowed with conceptualization, because breathing is intrinsically connected with dualism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And dualism is the basis for conceptualization. We have always to remember that vikalpa is, in grammar, is the meaning of syllable va, is the particle va is called vikalpa. So vikalpa is option, is distinction. That's first of all. And the first distinction is breathing. So, I don't know if you have answered.
A follow-up question? Yeah.
Did I answer to you?
Yes, I think.
Yes, yes, at 7 I have to leave, but we have still 13 minutes, yes.
It's okay?
Yeah. No, 7:40, but yes. Yeah.
Just a quick question if you don't want to answer it. Okay, obviously. The second thing I wanted to ask is the Buddhists usually have much more boring texts, of course, so they don't talk about sexual energy, but more about sleep in the context also of conceptual awareness. So, right, sleep is a sort of special state, especially deep sleep, when you're not dreaming and things like that.
Yes,
so
yes,
I wonder, is there a consideration in the Shaiva sources you've studied
Yes.
for time, how it
Yes.
proceeds?
Yes,
it's connected to
I've never
conceptualization?
personally investigated, but yes, there are traces of that. No, I mean in Buddhist context, as far as I know, there is more, and in Advaita Vedanta context, there is more. And our common friend Gianni Pellegrini has studied those texts, and he has also written some papers on that. So perhaps, or I can ask him to pass you the papers, or I can ask him to give me the bibliography and pass this to you. So, sorry, I'm not able to answer more than that. Okay, it seems that.
Any more questions? Well, if not, I guess time is up. So thank you, Francesco, for this very interesting lecture. Thank you all for being here and attending the seminar yesterday and today. And hopefully I will see you again soon, perhaps next year with something else. I was actually trying to figure what's next. Thank you.